The evening Cordelia Vane arrived at Harwick Hall, she counted 16 candles in the entrance hall and told herself it was enough light to see by. She had learned in the 2 years since her father's death to take stock of a room before she allowed herself to feel anything about it. The number of exits, the distance between herself and the nearest door. Whether the servants looked at her with pity or contempt, those were always the first two options when a woman arrived somewhere she did not quite belong. Harwick Hall offered her a third option she had not anticipated: indifference. The footman who took her travelling coat did not linger on her dress, which was decent but not fashionable. The housekeeper, a compact woman named Mrs. Peel, led her upstairs without commentary. And Simon Harwick, the Baron of Harwick, waited at the top of the staircase with his hands behind his back and said simply, "Miss Vane, I trust the journey was manageable. Not warm, but not unkind." She told herself that was enough. Cordelia's father had been a physician, not a grand one, not the sort who attended lords at their country seats, but the sort who was called to the mills at 4 a.m. when a man's hand had gone through the press. She had gone with him more times than she could count. She knew how to set a broken finger in the dark. She knew how to speak to a person who was frightened without letting them know she was frightened too. What she did not know was how to be a baroness. She had not intended to marry Simon Harwick. The arrangement had been proposed by her late father's closest friend, a solicitor named Mr. Aldous Trent, who had known the Harwick family for 30 years, and understood that the Baron required a wife with practical sense rather than a fortune or a pedigree. The previous Lady Harwick had died in childbed 3 years prior, taking the infant with her. Simon had been, by all accounts, a changed man since, quieter, more careful, the kind of man who counted his words before he spent them. Cordelia had been, by all accounts, a woman with very few prospects and an admirable steadiness under pressure. Mr. Trent had introduced them in the parlour of his London offices on a Tuesday in March. Simon had asked her 3 questions: whether she could manage a household of 12 staff, whether she had any objection to the countryside in winter, and whether she was afraid of dogs. She had answered yes, no, and no, in that order. He had nodded once, as though ticking items from a list, and said he would write to her by Friday. He had written by Thursday. She had not, in those first weeks of the engagement, told him about her hands. There was no natural moment for it. The gloves she wore were good ones, kidskin, the nicest things she owned, and she kept them on during their 3 chaperoned meetings and throughout the quiet civil ceremony at St. Bartholomew's in April. She told herself she would tell him once they were settled. Once the strangeness of it had worn down a little, once she understood what kind of man she had married. The difficulty with Harwick Hall was that it also contained Eleanor. Simon's younger sister was 22 years old and had been, as far as Cordelia could determine, the de facto mistress of the household for the 3 years since the previous Lady Harwick had died. She was not unkind in any obvious way. She was prompt with greetings and correct with table manners, and she always said good night before she retired. But she watched Cordelia the way a person watches a new piece of furniture they have not yet decided where to place. The gloves were the first thing Eleanor noticed. "You wore them at dinner," she said on Cordelia's 3rd evening at Harwick Hall. Not an accusation, just an observation delivered while they waited in the drawing-room for Simon to join them. "A habit," Cordelia said, "a peculiar one." Eleanor tilted her head. "Are your hands cold? Sometimes?" Eleanor said nothing more that evening, but Cordelia felt the question follow her up the stairs. She had not been hiding exactly. She had been waiting. That was what she told herself when she lay awake in the large, unfamiliar bed, listening to the owls outside and the occasional creak of the house settling. She was waiting for the right moment, for a morning when Simon sat across from her at the breakfast table, with his newspaper lowered and his attention present, when she might say quietly, "I want to show you something," and then take off the gloves. The scars on her hands were not ugly, or so Dr. Fenwick, her father's old colleague, had told her after the accident. They were healed well. They were not disfiguring. They were simply visible in a way that people found unsettling, the way anything visible and unasked tends to unsettle people who move in circles where bodies are supposed to be unmarked. She had been 19. The fire had started in the apothecary's storeroom at the back of her father's surgery in a city winter, when she had been the only person present. She had gotten the patients out. 2 of them. An elderly man with a bandaged leg and a young mother with her infant. And then she had gone back for her father's journals, which contained the medical histories of half the neighbourhood and which he would have grieved the loss of more than the surgery itself. She had gotten the journals. She had not gotten out before the shelving came down. Her father had wept when he saw her hands. She had not, because there had not seemed to be any point in it by then. She had said, very practically, that she still had the use of them. And it was true, she did. And she had gone home and learned to do everything she had always done but differently, with more attention to how she positioned her fingers and how much heat she could trust herself near. She had kept the gloves for society, not for herself. At Harwick Hall, the gloves had become something she was not sure how to be without. The dinner at which everything came undone was not a grand occasion. It was a modest gathering, 8 guests in addition to herself and Simon, local families, the sort of dinner that happened 4 or 5 times a season at any house of this size. A Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell from the neighbouring estate, the Reverend Alcott and his wife, 2 unmarried daughters of a local magistrate, whose name Cordelia kept confusing with another. A cousin of Simon's from the north, a cheerful young man named Peter, who had been teasing Eleanor about her embroidery all evening. Eleanor sat 3 seats down from Cordelia, across the table, near enough to speak to, far enough that Cordelia had allowed herself to relax. She should not have. The wine had been poured twice, and the conversation had warmed into the kind of pleasant meaninglessness that makes a dinner feel easy. Cordelia was listening to Mrs. Caldwell describe a problem with the wisteria on the east wall of her orangery when she heard Eleanor say, to no one in particular, Lady Harwick always wears her gloves to dinner. Isn't that curious? The table did not go silent. It shifted, the way a room shifts when something is said that was intended to land somewhere specific. Cordelia set down her fork. "I've been wondering," Eleanor continued, with the pleasant tone of someone making harmless conversation, "what it is she's covering." "Eleanor." Simon's voice was quiet and level. "I only mean it is rather warm in here, and gloves at dinner are not exactly customary. And we are all friends here, aren't we?" Eleanor smiled at Mrs. Caldwell, who looked uncomfortable. "I thought perhaps Lady Harwick might feel comfortable enough among friends too." She reached across the corner of the table. Later, Cordelia would think that what happened in the next moment was not Eleanor's hand closing over hers, was not the tug at the wrist of the glove, was not even the sound of the kidskin sliding free. What she would remember was the particular quality of the silence that followed, how it was not horror or revulsion, not any of the things she had spent years imagining. It was simply stillness. 8 people who did not know where to look. Her right hand lay on the white tablecloth. The scars ran from her knuckles to her wrist and partway up her forearm. Silver pink, ridged in places, smooth in others, the record of one night in winter and a shelf of falling bottles and the smell of camphor burning. Cordelia did not move. Eleanor, who had been smiling, was no longer smiling. Simon pushed back his chair. He did not speak immediately. He walked the length of the table slowly, the way a man walks when he is making a decision and intends to make it only once. He stopped at his sister's chair. He looked at Cordelia's hand on the tablecloth. Then he looked at Eleanor. "I will speak with you in the morning," he said. Eleanor opened her mouth. "In the morning," he said again, and then he held out his hand to Cordelia, not her gloved hand, the other one, the bare one, and waited. She took it. He helped her to her feet. He said to the table, in an even voice that offered no opening for commentary, "Please excuse us. Enjoy the remainder of the evening." He nodded at Mrs. Peel, who appeared in the doorway as if summoned by some domestic instinct. And then he led Cordelia out of the dining room and into the corridor. And then, when the door had closed behind them, he stopped. They stood in the corridor. Cordelia could hear the murmur of the table behind the door, the sound of conversation resuming the way conversation always does, filling the space where the strange thing happened. She waited for Simon to speak. He was looking at her hand, still holding it, the bare one. He turned it over carefully, as though it were a letter he was reading for the first time. "The fire," she said finally. "I was 19. I've had the full use of my hands since. I should have told you." "Yes," he said. "You should have. I was afraid you would think." "I know what you were afraid I would think." He looked up at her then, and his expression was not what she had expected, which had been some combination of pity and displeasure. It was simply direct, attentive in the way he was occasionally attentive at breakfast, as though he had set something else down in order to look properly. "Cordelia, did you get everyone out?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon, from the fire. You went back in, I assume for a reason. My father's journals." And the patients were already out. Before that, 2 of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then that is what I think." She did not entirely know what to do with that. She stood in the corridor of Harwick Hall with one bare hand and one gloved hand, and her husband holding the bare one, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. "Your sister," she started. "My sister," he said, "has been the mistress of this house for 3 years, and she will need some time to understand that she is no longer." He said it with neither anger nor apology, as a man states a fact he has been putting off stating. "That is my fault, not yours. I should have managed it better before you arrived. I'm sorry that I didn't." She thought of Eleanor's face when the glove had come free, not triumphant, as she had expected, but struck, as though she had pulled back a curtain expecting one thing and found something else entirely, and could not now decide what to do with herself. "She is not cruel," Cordelia said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "No," Simon said, "she isn't, but she has not been kind to you, and that I will not leave unaddressed." They returned to the dining room 20 minutes later, when Cordelia had composed herself and Simon had not needed to compose himself at all, or had done so in some way that was invisible. The table received them with the careful cordiality of people who have agreed, without discussion, not to mention the thing that happened. Peter made a joke about the wine. Mrs. Caldwell asked Cordelia about the gardens. The Reverend Alcott said something about the weather that no one quite heard. Cordelia sat with both hands in her lap. She had left the glove in the corridor. Eleanor did not speak again that evening. The conversation Simon had with his sister the following morning was one Cordelia was not present for, which was as she preferred it. She was in the kitchen garden when it happened, speaking with the head groundskeeper about which beds might be cleared for spring planting, doing the thing she had found most useful in the 4 weeks since her arrival, making herself quietly necessary. She heard Eleanor's voice once, raised briefly, and then silence. At lunch, Eleanor came to the table and said, to the tablecloth more than to Cordelia, "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong." A pause. "I have been wrong about a good many things." Cordelia looked at her for a moment. Eleanor's face was composed, in the way faces are composed when the composing has taken effort. "Thank you," Cordelia said, and then, because she had never found the long silence useful, "I was frightened to tell Simon about my hands. I think perhaps I made that your problem when it was mine. I'm sorry for the awkwardness I caused." Eleanor looked up at her then. Some of the composure slipped. "You were frightened," she said. "Of what? That I had misrepresented myself," Cordelia said. "That he would feel he had been given something other than what he'd agreed to. Men don't always like surprises." "No," Eleanor said slowly. "They don't." Something moved across her face, some private consideration. "Simon, though, he's not." She stopped. Started again. "He lost our mother when we were young. I think he understands more than most what it costs to keep carrying something alone." It was the most Eleanor had said to her that was not about the management of the household. "I think he does," Cordelia agreed. There was a pause. Outside, the groundskeeper was directing someone to the far bed. The sound of the garden carried easily through the open window. "I could show you the linen room this afternoon," Eleanor said. "You haven't seen it yet, Mrs. Peel handles it herself, but you ought to know where things are kept." "I'd like that," Cordelia said. It was not a friendship, not yet. Perhaps it would not be, not immediately, not in any simple way. But it was a door opened from the inside, which is the only way doors of that sort open, and Cordelia recognized it for what it was. In the weeks that followed, she learned that Harwick Hall had a pattern of small kindnesses that she had been too guarded to notice at first. Simon left books on the table in the library that he had marked with notes in the margins, not gifts exactly, not announced, just placed there, available, as though he was extending a conversation he hadn't started aloud. Mrs. Peel, once she understood that Cordelia was not interested in undoing the system that had kept the house running for 3 years, became brisk and useful, and occasionally, in a spare moment, almost warm. She learned that Simon could not sleep easily on nights when the wind was high. She learned this because she also could not, and the library was the place she went when sleep failed her. And one night in late May she came downstairs to find him already there, sitting with a book he wasn't reading in the chair nearest the fire. He looked up. He said, "The east window rattles when the wind comes from that direction. I should have it seen to." "I don't mind," she said. "I wasn't sleeping anyway." She took the chair on the other side of the fire. He handed her the book he wasn't reading. She looked at the title. It was a medical text, Culpepper's Herbal, old and much annotated. "This was my father's," he said, which answered the question she hadn't asked. "He was a physician too, of sorts. A committed amateur. He'd have liked to speak with yours, I think. They would have had a great deal to argue about," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had yet seen. She read, and he looked at the fire, and the wind moved outside, and the house settled around them in the way old houses do, as though finding its own comfort. She thought about what Eleanor had said, about Simon understanding what it costs to carry something alone. She thought about her hands in her lap, ungloved now in private as a matter of course, because the effort of hiding indoors had become simply too tiring. She thought about what it would be to put the thing down. Not to be rid of it. The scars would not go, and the memory of the fire would not go, and she would not have wanted either to, because they were hers and they had made her who she was. But to stop carrying it as though it were something to be ashamed of, that was a different thing. "Simon," she said. He looked up. "Thank you for what you did at dinner." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have done more. I should have spoken to Eleanor before your arrival and made the situation clear. I was." He paused, and she thought she could see the effort of it, the man who counted words before spending them, searching for the right ones. "I think I was hoping the adjustment would happen on its own. It was a failure of attention, and you paid for it. I'm not certain it would have changed things," she said honestly. Eleanor needed to see for herself. Some people do, perhaps. He was looking at her hands, which were resting in her lap, not with the expression she had imagined for years. Not pity, not discomfort, but with the same quality of attention he brought to the books he left on the library table, as though she were something he was still in the process of reading. "How did you know, that night? That going back was worth it." "I didn't," she said. "I knew the journals couldn't save themselves, and I was there. That was all." He nodded. That was the answer he had expected, she thought. That was the answer that had led Mr. Trent, who had known them both, to suggest this particular arrangement, not because she was accomplished or wealthy or well-connected, but because she was the kind of person who went back for the journals. She hoped she was still that person, after everything. She thought she might be. Outside, the wind shifted. The east window stopped its rattling. The fire settled. "I was going to tell you," she said, "about my hands. I want you to know that. I had a plan for it. A good moment some morning when you weren't distracted. I had rehearsed it. How did the rehearsal go? Poorly. I kept revising it." He looked at her with that almost smile again. "What was the worst version?" "I had considered simply removing both gloves at once and presenting my hands and saying I have a confession, which I then decided had a somewhat criminal implication." He did smile then properly, which transformed his face entirely, and Cordelia felt the shift of it in her own chest, the way an unexpected warmth feels when you have been cold for a long time. "You could still do that," he said. "If you'd like the dramatic version." "I think," she said, "the dinner managed the drama quite well on its own." "It did," he agreed. They sat in the library until the fire burned low, and then he banked it, and she carried the lamp, and they went upstairs to their separate rooms. It was still that, still separate, still careful, and at the top of the stairs he said good night in the way he always did, which was quietly and with attention, as though he meant it. She said good night back, and meant it too. By autumn, Harwick Hall had a different quality to it. Not transformed. It was still the same stone and timber and rattling east window, still Mrs. Peel's precisely managed linen room and the hounds in the yard, and the kitchen garden coming in for the season. But there was something within it that had settled, as the house settled on windy nights, into its own weight. Eleanor had begun, cautiously, to bring her questions to Cordelia rather than to Mrs. Peel. Small things at first. whether the Caldwells would expect to be seated near the fire at the next dinner, whether the green silk in the upstairs trunk was worth mending or had gone too far. Then larger ones. A matter of household accounts she was uncertain about. A letter from a young man in Edinburgh she was not certain she should answer. Cordelia gave her opinion when asked. Did not give it when not asked. That was the thing, she had found, with people who needed to arrive at their own conclusions. You held the door and waited, and when they came through it, you did not make a production of the fact. On a morning in October, she came downstairs to find Simon in the entrance hall with his coat and hat, and the expression of a man about to leave on a long errand, and he stopped when he saw her and said, simply, "Come with me." "Where?" "The mill at Fenton. There's been an injury." "Greer tells me it's the hand." A pause. "I thought you might be of some use." She looked at him. He looked back, direct and waiting, in the way he had on the stairs on the night of her arrival, when everything had been strange and she had not yet understood what kind of man she had married. She went for her coat. They drove to Fenton in the light morning fog, and the injured man, a young labourer, 20 or so, his right hand wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth, looked up at Cordelia with the panicked eyes of a person in pain, and she sat down beside him and said, in the quiet, practical voice her father had taught her, "Let me see," and he let her see, and she assessed the damage and told him clearly what could be done and what would heal and what would not, and she saw his breathing slow as she spoke, because there is a particular gift in being spoken to plainly by someone who knows what they are talking about. Afterward, when they were driving back, Simon said, "Your father trained you, informally, for years." She looked at the road ahead. "I've kept current with the literature. I always meant to. I don't know what I meant to do with it exactly. Continue as I could. There is a midwife in the village who has been struggling for 2 seasons without an experienced colleague. She's asked me repeatedly if I knew anyone." He said it without ceremony, the way he said things when he was not sure how they would land, and had decided to put them plainly anyway. "I told her I would ask." Cordelia looked at him. "I am asking," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought of her hands, bare in her lap in the morning light, the scars that had become simply part of the landscape of herself, unremarkable in the way things become unremarkable when they are no longer being hidden. She thought of her father's voice saying, "Go back for what matters." She thought of the young man's breathing slowing as she spoke. "Yes," she said, "tell her yes." He nodded. He did not make a speech about it. He turned his attention back to the road. She turned hers back to the road as well, and watched the morning fog lifting off the fields of Harwick, and thought that this specific, particular, unannounced life was not what she had imagined, which meant it was something better than imagination. It was the thing itself. The east window of the library rattled that night, and neither of them was sleeping, and they both went downstairs. And this time Simon brought a second lamp without being asked.